What's going on, fellas? This is questions number 41, I believe. So I will be answering the questions you guys left for me in the community post that I put up, as well as the questions from the previous questions video. So as always, if you guys have anything you would like my opinion on as it relates to strength training or nutrition, please leave them in the comments of this video or put them in the community post that I will put up the day before I do the next one of these. And here is your reminder that if you enjoy the video, to leave a like, because apparently that's important. So we're just going to get straight into the questions. There's a decent number of them, and they're a little bit more complex this week, so this video might run a little bit long. The first question is, general best practices for programming front squats. My goal is not for getting a huge front squat as far as the 1RM, but using it as a secondary volume to back squat / deadlift, since I don't have any leg machines in my garage and front squats can spare my lower back. Great rationale, I think I follow so far. In short, what are some ways to implement front squats volume / intensity as a secondary variation? So just a couple of general notes, just asking for general best practice for use of front squat to build up other lifts, not to maximize your front squat 1RM. One is to focus on your mobility. So when you're warming up, hang out in a third world squat or put a plate on the bar, depending on what your max is, hang out at the bottom, pause the first rep of your first couple warm-ups. Nailing your mobility in your positions is going to let you push this exercise quite a bit harder than just rushing in with poor mobility, poor patterns, and just trying to slam as much weight on the bar as possible. You're not going to make it as far, you're not going to use the same total tonnages, and likely you're not going to get the same amount of carryover. So spending the time to warm up and get moving well before you start, anytime you start front squatting, even if it's secondary motion. The easiest way to do this is doing like a long pause with the first rep of each set, or if we're just doing this for carryover, there is a very strong argument to make that a pause front squat, just always pausing every front squat you do, is just as, if not more effective. So that's certainly something I would play around with as well, just to keep them highly standardized. I think a paused front squat is a phenomenal general strength building exercise. It doesn't get much better than that as far as building up your mid back, as far as your like mid thoracic spinal erectors, keeping your hips strong, keeping yourself mobile for the back squat goes a long way. So potentially pausing all your reps, if not pausing just the first rep. And generally speaking, if we're just doing it for general strength training, I would stick to the 3 to 6 rep range. I think higher than that, we're just kind of running into logistical issues of the bar choking us out or shifting if we're pushing those really hard. Any heavier, I just don't find is necessary. Maybe for long pause singles, you could take it up to singles, but generally speaking, doing most of your training in that 3, 4 to 6 range, I think is probably going to be the best use of your time. And because it's a self-limiting variation, you're not really testing your legs maximally. We're limited by so many things. The weight is going to be pretty sub-maximal when compared to our back squat. We're able to do it before something like a deadlift to force ourselves to get warmed up. So that's another potential use of the front squat. The next question is programming for the overhead press, how it differs from bench. Do you find that you have to use a different intensity ranges for the overhead press for most people's, because their overhead press 1RM is so much lower than their bench? Sometimes that ends up, assuming they've got good patterns, good mobility, like they're doing it well, they don't have any shoulder issues coming in. The main difference is because the absolute tonnage is a little bit lower, usually we're going to be looking at a few more work sets per week to kind of reach up towards our MRV in a hypertrophy phase. That would be one key difference. Is usually people's working volume for the overhead, assuming equal technical proficiency, is going to be a little bit higher than it is for the bench press. And the other note is if we're working on maximizing our 1RM, maybe through the whole hypertrophy phase, we stick to truly hypertrophy rep ranges, but to start introducing some heavier touches, even in the strength phase before we get to a peaking power phase, just because there are times at which you can build up your overhead press for reps, especially if you're using a bounce out of the bottom where you can smash a new 5RM, but your 1RM hasn't budged. you can either start implementing heavy touches earlier in the training cycle, or you can be like strict about making sure that you pause all of your reps. That way each rep is like the first rep where we're having to create force without that use of like elastic tension. But honestly, I think they're very similar. You know, the same principles apply of maximizing relevant hypertrophy, training a bit like a bodybuilder. I find training antagonistic musculature is really helpful. Much the same that pull downs and rows after benching is helpful. Pull downs and rows after overhead pressing I find quite helpful. Much the same as how I might supplement a bench press with a vertical press. I would supplement a vertical press with a horizontal press, maybe a dip. Doesn't have to be a true horizontal, it could be an incline, but supplementing your vertical presses with something that's at a lower angle where we're going to be using a bit more absolute load and challenge the triceps a bit more. I find them to be very similar programming wise, and programming them relatively similarly has brought me a lot of success. The next question is best ways to increase the sumo deadlift without deadlifting. The reason is that I want to increase the frequency of my squat to 2 to 3 times a week because I want to rebuild it. If you're not a beginner, you're not going to have a good time building up a technical lift by not doing aforementioned technical lift. It's not going to work unless you're a beginner. And if you're maybe intermediate, if you're doing a heavy enough hip hinging motion to build up your sumo deadlift, it's going to be as taxing as if you were deadlifting anyway, if not more. So what I would recommend is rather than not sumo deadlifting, you do it submaximally, right? After those squats, just supplement with light sumos to get the practice in, practice the motor pattern, get some work in, but not so much that it's detracting from the squats. Rather than saying like, oh, I either train this lift maximally or I don't train it at all, and I need to build it up with accessories. The accessories that are going to build a deadlift are going to tax you in the same way as a deadlift would, so there's no benefit to not doing the deadlift. Just leave a few more reps in reserve if you're prioritizing another lift. Don't eliminate the other one entirely. The next question is how to improve thoracic mobility. I have absolutely awful thoracic mobility, and it makes any overhead press exercise look absolutely atrocious. My overhead press looks like a standing incline bench, and I feel my lower back more than anything. I've tried to do a bunch of T-spine mobility drills in the past. They all seem for naught. Since as soon as I do a single set of bench, all of my stiffness comes back tenfold. I'm seriously considering giving up on ever pushing barbell overhead press and sticking with seated dumbbell overhead press, maybe Z presses oddly, since I can do those with decent form as well. So kind of going in reverse order, there's nothing magical about the standing barbell overhead press for the shoulders. There's nothing that's achieving that a seated overhead press doesn't, especially if it's just for general development of the shoulders, or carry over to the bench press. There's a good argument that seated is better because we're just eliminating one potential limiting factor that isn't the shoulders, being stability, core strength, whatever you might want to call it. So you don't have to, unless your goal is to get a strong standing overhead press, in which case, yeah, you got a standing overhead press. I think doing some mobility can be helpful. I think that calling this purely T-spine mobility might be a bit of a miss. It could just be that your lats and your pecs are tight, so we can't achieve a good overhead position, in which case doing a little bit of T-spine mobility over a roller or some cat camels, some quadruped elbow to ceilings like so, alongside doing dead hangs every day where you just hang from the bar, sometimes letting your shoulders come up towards your ears, but then other times doing like a 30-second hang, pinning our shoulder blades down and back to mobilize our lats and our pecs. That might be the issue. So as far as what to do for the mobility, I would do that routine I just mentioned. One thing that can be helpful is kind of an intermediate between a standing overhead press and a Z press is doing a no back support seated overhead press. I used to do these a lot years ago just as a self-limiting variation because you're unable to lay back at all, but it's a little bit heavier than you could take a Z press. It doesn't have the same mobility requirements at the hip. So maybe you could do 2 full training cycles of no back support seated overhead press until you're relatively strong at those. You'll build up the musculature associated with staying upright, be that the strength in the shoulder to drive it up without laying back, because that can be part of the issue. The abdominal strength to maintain your positions. You can use that as your primary overhead until you're pretty strong at it, and then take a foray back into standing rather than stick to strictly Z press. I think that might be another perfectly valid option. as well. I hope that helps. I think that definitely taking a hard look at your pecs and your lats might be helpful. Taking a hard look at your weight selection. It might be that you're pushing it unrealistically heavy, so you have to lay back and turn it into a standing incline press to move the weight well, because as you said, you can do a Z press, which means you more than likely could do a light overhead press. So being really honest with your motor patterning and not putting more weight on the bar than you can do in a really strict way and gradually building that up might be a solution as well. The next one is, how come no one trains the Olympic lifts when they should? Well, that's a strong opinion. Why should they? There's nothing magical about those motions. I mean, if you want to have a strong snatch and a strong clean and jerk, then yes, you should do them. But if the argument is general power development, we have other motions that we can do that require less investment as far as mobility and as far as skill to be reasonably technically proficient and safe at them. We could just do a clean pull. We don't need to do a full clean. And a lot of people don't really train for power development past what they can get out of traditional lifts. So I guess I would ask you, why should they be doing them? I mean, they're perfectly fine motions, but if someone's goal isn't to be strong at them, I don't think they're missing out on a tremendous amount by not doing them. I personally don't do the Olympic lifts. The closest thing I do is a continental clean on the axle. There's plenty of other motions I work into my weekly routine that can develop like rate of power production, right? I don't know. It just seems like a lot of work, and it's like the amount of work I would have to do on my mobility and the amount of time I would have to spend training them to become reasonably proficient. I would need to hit them several times a week, and it would detract from all of the other strength training that I'm doing, and I'm sure that's kind of where other people find them as well. So I guess I would ask you, why should they? The next one is how to find how many calories we burned during our cutting cycle. I'm guessing you mean how many calories you need to eat per day. I mean, you could just, if you want to know how many calories you burn during your cutting cycle, just how many calories do you burn per day, and then multiply that by how long it was. If you want to know how much you should eat per day in your cutting cycle, which I'm guessing is where you are going with this, the best thing you can do is track your food for a week. If your body weight did not change across that week, whatever the average, so you add up all the individual days worth of calories, divide it by 7, whatever the average amount of calories you intook across that week is roughly your maintenance. And then we probably just take 200-300 calories off of that, and that's how many calories you should be eating on a cut. The next question is training frequencies in terms of beginners to advanced, gender, and natural versus enhanced. So this is a kind of interesting one. If we're assuming relatively similar technical proficiency, all of this is going to kind of boil down to absolute load. Whether if it's a really strong, super heavyweight natural guy, it's gonna look different than a light, enhanced guy, right? Because more than likely the super heavyweight natural guy is lifting more absolute tonnage, or vice versa. We could have basically just comes down to tonnage. Same thing with like the gender, right? If they're equally technically proficient, if you have a man and a woman whose bench max is both 155 pounds, you're probably going to be looking at a pretty high benching frequency of 3 to 4 times a week. And if you have like someone who benches quite a bit, again, assuming technical proficiency is the same, we're going to be looking at roughly the same frequencies. The one thing that can change this is technique. If you're someone who's got a very reduced range of motion, and is very mechanically efficient in that regard, you're usually going to look at a higher frequency on average. So if you have a 500-pound small ROM bencher and a 500-pound close grip bencher, even if both of them are technically skilled, because of the difference in work per rep, the short range of motion bencher is going to handle a much higher frequency. But generally speaking, I'm just going to throw this out there because most of the guys who watch these videos fall into the same demographic of relatively young guys who with a pretty average body weight. I generally like having people bench or press in some regard 3 days a week, squat 2 days a week, deadlift 1 day a week. If you've got good leverages for deadlifting and you recover from it well, potentially going to 1 deadlift day, 1 RDL day. And if you're built really well for deadlifts and or you recover from it really well, or you're a sumo deadlifter who's good at it, that would look like 2 squats and 2 deadlifts. That would be my general off the bat recommendation for most people. Just kind of going through your list, right? Generally speaking, beginners probably need a little bit lower frequencies to drive adaptation, and they're a little bit less mechanically efficient. So if you try to throw a beginner with poor form into a 5 days a week bench routine, they're going to get banged up. Whereas if you're a very efficient advanced lifter, you could do that. But if that being advanced also comes with way more tonnage, that frequency might never increase. So I think that depends. Gender, generally speaking, because the absolute tonnage is lower, women are going to lift higher frequencies on average. And natural versus enhanced, I think I talked about this in that other video, because even though they have improved recovery capabilities, especially in their muscles, that doesn't necessarily translate to the soft tissue recovery directly in the same regard. And because the enhanced lifter is lifting more absolute tonnage, I would say on average they're actually going to lift at a lower frequency than the natural lifter. Controversial statement, but that would be generally what I have observed. The next question is, how do you decide on progressions in volume block to block for your athletes? Or decide when to change things block to block. Example, you used to do a 9, 8, 7 down to 1 progression of top sets. Now you do 8s, 5s, 3s. Generally, what I do just comes down to what I observe to be working the best on average, and then deviate from that, right? I've got basically a scheme of things that I have observed that work best for a blind first shot at a program. We see how that first one went, and then we adjust our volumes, our frequencies, our progression schemes based on whether it worked or not. If it worked really well, we do the exact same thing again. If it worked well for the squat and the deadlift, but the bench not so much, I ask them, I say, hey, how did you recover pretty well? And they're like, yeah, no, I always felt recovered. I was like, okay, probably we need to do a little bit more volume per session in the bench. But that's kind of how I would say I describe it, right? Is I've got this prescription that's kind of my first off the bat guess that just evolves with time based on what I observe to be working. And then I tailor it then after the first training cycle based on what amount of results were driven or not driven. As far as progression schemes, it's all arbitrary, right? We kind of have total volume allotments and percentages that we roughly need to hit at given times in a training cycle, and how you go about hitting those can be super variable. It really doesn't matter all that much, assuming like the technique is similar, the RPEs are similar, how we break up that total volume is going to result in more or less the same thing. So there's a lot of room for individual like preference, not just very individual variability, but just which way do they enjoy more, because they're going to buy in, they're going to try harder, and usually it'll have a better result. So training for people who genuinely have a chaotic schedule and bad recovery, which prevents or at least hampers them from having a consistent gym days, i.e. uni students or manual labor. Well, if you're a university student and you're not also working a job, if you can't make it to the gym every day, you're an idiot. I'm sorry, but you do not spend that much time doing homework outside of like finals week and midterms. Then you could, okay, finals week, midterms, the gym schedule can vary a little bit, but on a weekly basis, I think if you add up the time you're in class and if you add up the time you're spending doing homework, if you manage your time slightly better, you have time to make it to the gym on a consistent basis. That being said, if you are working a job, I totally get it. Been there. It sucks. It can be variable. And basically the rest of the question, he says, I know Bromley and Bald Omni-Man have both made videos on the topic, but I'm wondering what additional thoughts you have on the topic. So I don't know if I've seen Mr. Butler or Bromley's video on this. I think I might have watched it, but I'm blanking on what they said. So I'll just tell you what I tell people, which is, let's say you have 4 training sessions per week. I don't really care how long it takes. If you're not prepping for a meet, a week doesn't need to take a week. It could take a week and a half. It could take less than a week. If you're got an easy week of school or you got an easy week at work and you want to train back-to-back days, go for it. As long as we're not trying to line up our training cycles with a meet, how long each microcycle takes can be pretty variable based on a recovery. So if it needs to take you a week and a half, go for it. I think a lot of lifters have found a lot of success with these more flexible schedules. If you finish up work and you're like, holy shit, I feel like dog shit. If I go to the gym, it's not going to be a very productive session. And all you have to do is say, oh, I'll just do it tomorrow. And suddenly that session goes from a shitter to a quality session, another check mark down the list of just putting in quality sessions. All you have to do is wait till the next day. Absolutely go for it. That's what I would tell anyone who has that question, is like, hey man, just take your time when you like try to make it in like as often as you can, and doing a good job. Don't be late. Use it as an excuse to be lazy and take like 2.5 weeks to do 4 training sessions. Then you're just being lazy and you're not going to progress. But if it's someone who's driven and likes to train, I will usually give them that free rein to like, hey, this week can take you as long as you need. Just put in quality sessions, have fun. And if you don't think you're going to be able to put in a quality session and have fun, don't go. Just do it the next day. The next question is, do tall guys, long legs, short torso, need to auto-regulate something in their leg training? Should they consider doing more volume? What advice would you give to a tall person who wants to get stronger at the big 3? So I want to tell you to not change anything, because I think a lot of people will give themselves an out simply because they have long femurs or are tall, and will get out of training things in just a logical manner, because they think it's much harder for them than it is for everyone else. But it's only a bit harder for them than it is for anyone else. I want to tell you that, but there can be some training considerations, right? Usually the longer femured lifter is going to be able to handle a little bit more hip hinging volume simply because their torso is shorter. Just the length of that lever is less. The torque placed on the lower back is less due to the shorter lever. So they're going to be able to handle more volume as far as hinging, and they're going to maybe be able to handle a little bit less volume as far as like pure squatting motions. Using supplemental motions to kind of run up extra leg volume in ways that don't tax you quite as much can be very helpful. But what I would tell you is usually you're going to be looking at a little bit of an increase in hinging volume, a little bit of a decrease in squatting pattern volume. You might need to utilize motions that really force you to use your quads, because more than often than not, if you're a guy with long femurs, you have a stronger posterior chain because of your ability to train it being better. And you're going to take over any back squat you do for the most part by utilizing your strong posterior chain, which kind of has a compounding effect where that gets more and more dramatic. So doing something like a front squat, doing something like a high bar, mostly high bar squatting, doing something like an SSB or a reverse SSB, handles up regular SSB, something where we're displacing the load forward and placing more demands on our knee extensors can be really helpful for these people. One of the best lifters I have ever had the pleasure of training with, Nate Alexander. You should follow him on Instagram. The guy is just an absolute stud. He works like a very physical job. He comes in and he deadlifts 3 times a week, pulling like 800 on a stiff bar every single session. He had the USAPL national record in the deadlift in the open class for the 120 minus class. One of the nicest guys I've ever met. Super nice guy, very tall, 6'3", very long femurs. And what he found for himself was that doing higher rep sets buried him disproportionately due to the greater work per rep. Doing like a set of 8 on the squat ended up just giving him such a disproportionate amount of fatigue, it would take him a week to get out of it. So what he found is training, like there's the old triangle, right? You have volume, intensity, and frequency, and you probably can only have 2 of those high at a given time. 3, you're probably going to fall apart. 1, you're probably not going to progress as well as you could. And different methodologies and at different times, smart methodologies, you're switching which ones, right, through a training cycle. But different people will find the methodology work for them is kind of highlighting 2 of those. And he found that straying a little bit away from the volume and focusing on frequency and higher intensity but lower per session volumes was very helpful for him. So I feel like I would be remiss not to mention what the best tall lifter I know swears by as his training consideration is he will squat pretty often, but the per session volume is quite low. But the other thing that I think is worth mentioning for Nate is Nate comes from a bodybuilding background, right? He was a good natural bodybuilder, which means he prior put in a lot of reps on things that he could handle, like leg extensions or a hack squat or a leg press, to build up the mass. So maybe that methodology might not be good until you've spent the time building up a little bit more mass. But this is all rambling. I would tell you, you're going to do a little bit more hinging, do a little bit less squatting. Make sure your squatting is really targeting your knee extensors, especially if you're doing general strength training. Do some motions where you can't take over with your back, be it those squat variations I mentioned, or hack squats, or belt squats. Make sure you're making use of those. And really just hold yourself to a high standard. Build up the legs. Yeah, don't use it as an out is the biggest thing, but work around your recovery constraints that are unique to you. And then the final one is your favorite progression scheme i.e. linear, step loading, how you run them across multiple training cycles. Okay, this is I need a whiteboard. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to convey this really well, but I'm just going to tell you guys the old school methodology that I like is like, if you have 2 weeks of 10s, 2 weeks of 8s, 2 weeks of 5s, 2 weeks of 3s, and 2 weeks of 1s, right? I don't know how many that was. I'm going to guess that was probably like a 10-week training cycle. I should have listened to myself while I was talking, but something like that. You run through these, maybe the first week you leave a couple in the tank, second week a tougher set of that reps. First week you leave a little in the tank, or if you're someone who needs to do more volume, you're doing straight sets of these numbers. You run through a training cycle, and once you've run through that training cycle once, you have a backlog of exactly what you need to do to be better. As long as you have 5 more pounds on the bar on week 1, 5 more pounds on the bar on week 2, and the efforts are comparable, so we're not forcing it when it's not there. As long as we have 5 more pounds in the bar on each corresponding amount of volume, we're going to end with probably a 5-pound PR, more than likely, maybe a 10-pound PR. So once we run through any progression once, we have a reference for where we should be to slightly exceed it the following block, as long as we bear in mind RPEs. So it's like if we hit the same number but 1 RPE lower, again, we've achieved, we're better than we were on this corresponding week, last training cycle. We're exactly where we need to be. So as soon as you run through your first training cycle of any progression, you have like this ultimate compendium of like, am I progressing as I should be? And if I'm not, what do I need to change to do so? I do like, the other thing I like is working off of auto-regulated reps. So usually when people have auto-regulation in their program, it'll be like 3 sets of 5 at RPE 7. So we know what the sets is, we know what the reps is, and it's on the athlete to find, based on that day, based on how prepared they are that session, what weight do I need to put on the bar to hit an RPE 7. I find that most people fuck this up if they're not good advanced lifters. I find most people will miss, and they're just going to have an innate bias to always undershoot or always overshoot. I mean, maybe you have some stud who's going to progress great because he nails his RPE every time, but most people have one bias in one direction or the other. What I like to do instead is, instead of auto-regulating the loading, we're auto-regulating the reps. So we know the number of sets. So we got 3 sets at 63%, so we're in a hypertrophy phase. And I say rep until you have 3 reps in reserve. So AMRAP at 7, whatever you want to call it, rep until 3 RIR is usually what I say. So 3 sets, 3x, 3 RIR at 63%. And each set, you go until you have this subjective feeling you have roughly 3 in the tank. And it doesn't need to be an exact science. And people who tell you that missing your RPE by 1 on 1 set in a hypertrophy phase is going to have any meaningful impact on your progression is bullshitting you. There's not that degree of precision within coaching and programming. There's so many things that we as coaches don't know that's going on in your life, even if we're really good about like asking about your stress, asking about your sleep. There's so many little minutia of variance that to say that missing your RPE by one time is going to have any meaningful impact is egregiously like self-aggrandizing. You're making yourself sound much smarter than you are if you think that's going to be a big deal. If someone's always missing by 1, you either need to change the program and just be like, if I want a 7, I'm going to tell them at 6, or you need to sit them down and try to get them realistic about it. And you can determine that based on how you think the athlete is going to respond to criticism. But that's what I like to do, is auto-regulate based on the reps and have a load. Like, we know by this point in the training cycle, we probably need to be touching about 75%. But if you're underprepared, that 75% might only be sets of 4 if you're having a really bad day, right? But we're getting our touches in at that percent. That's my general preference, right? It could be like 4% weekly jumps, right? 63 all the way up to 95%, and then you max out. That would be a 10-week training cycle. We're doing like maybe 4 sets at 3 RIR for the first 3-4 weeks. We're doing 3 sets at 2 RIR for the next couple weeks, 2 sets at 1 RIR, or singles at the end, with maybe some back down sets if you're someone who needs volume. Some people find that they legitimately, if they just work up to a top single and leave, they start detraining. They need that little back down volume to preserve their fitness. So you could add that in the last 3 weeks, but that's a progression scheme I love. At some point, I will buy a whiteboard and lay that out for you guys, because it's a very simple one that I think most of you could implement and see some success from. Thank you guys for watching my video. I appreciate all of you. Thank you.